Homeless encampments have become common aspects of the landscape throughout the United States in the last decade or so. Most recently, following the Grants Pass v. Johnson case, has been the quest for mayors, governors, and community members to dismantle the camps, even when there's no decent alternatives for housing for people, not even shelter space. Joining us today is on the podcast, Ending Homelessness, What is to be Done, is Dr. Jessie Speer from the London School of Economics. Dr. Speer is the author of the upcoming book, Bulldozed, Homeless Encampments and the Politics of Demolition, which provides important insights into these policies, as well as the real human beings harmed through the violence of the dismantling of camps, or, as Dr. Speer describes this, the attacks on urban informality. Jessie Speer conducted ethnographic research in one of the first of the large camps, that one in Fresno, California. This was also one of the first camps to be bulldozed when its existence stood in the way of political aspiration, hoped for gentrification, and economic development ideas. Such cruel public policies are often described as being in the best interest of the people living in the camps and about public safety and sanitation. However, this work and many other research projects demonstrates that these proclamations are full from the full and accurate story. I recommend you look for the book and read it when it's released later this year, both for the analysis of the policies and for the ways in which Jessie Speer describes people she came to know very well in doing this research, in ways that represent them as fully human, with strengths and skills and challenges, just like the rest of us have. Today's discussion then moves from the camps to analyzing how homelessness is integrated into broader aspects of neoliberal capitalism, which has made precarity a feature of life for so many people around the world today, both housed and unhoused people. Dr. Speer has not just studied in Fresno, but now does work in the UK and is globalizing the analysis of homelessness, which is one of the goals of this podcast as well as we move forward. This is especially the case in the 2023 paper, Worlding the Geographies of Homelessness, Formality, Precarity, and Theory from the Global South, as well as in the paper co-authored with David Madden, The Housing Squeeze Design, focuses as an intervention toward creating spaces for imagining and enacting more radically transformative housing possibilities. As our discussion emphasizes, if we hope to abolish homelessness, we need to find ways to move beyond the social and economic logics of neoliberal capitalism. This has been making so many of us economically, socially, and economically insecure today. It is fascinating and important work that Dr. Speer has been doing. I welcome Jessie Speer to the podcast. Welcome, Dr. Jessie Speer. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I really wanted to invite you to these discussions to talk about your forthcoming book. I was excited to see that coming out. And then a little bit about the recent trends in cities, and then looking at your more recent work now that you're in the UK and how that compares to experiences in the US. But before we get into the book, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about how and why you started working on homelessness. I know for me, I started doing this as a young staff member in a small shelter in suburban Fairfield, Connecticut, of all places. But I really thought it was going to be part of a movement to end homelessness at the time. It was going to be a short-term thing. I didn't think I was going to do this for like 40 years. And still, that hasn't happened yet. All right, there hasn't been a big movement to end homelessness. It seems like it's been accepted now. But how about you? Why did you start doing this work? What did you hope to accomplish?
I love that you start out with this question because I'm sure you get a lot of really interesting answers from different people. I came to it sort of accidentally also, I suppose. I had a previous life where I thought that I would be a lawyer. I was a lawyer briefly, and I wanted to do public interest law and discovered, my youthful sort of hopeful aspirations to do some kind of radical lefty law, and then discovered that places that were offering free legal services were few and far between. And especially I graduated right from law school, right post 2008, and all of the legal aid clinics, their funding dried up. So
sounds like friends of mine who wanted to become environmental lawyers, studied environmental law, and then found out that the only people hiring environmental lawyers were the people who were destroying the environment.
Exactly. The number of corporate law jobs out there is astounding. And I knew that was the absolute opposite of the work I wanted to do. I worked for a little while doing eviction defense law, working in eviction defense clinics, and it didn't pay well. It wasn't like a permanent, secure position, and I wasn't really able to make it as an attorney. And so I turned to graduate school, but I was left with this kind of lingering impression from my days doing eviction defense of the fact that we had the same people coming in over and over again who were getting evicted over and over again. So I would see the same clients facing the problem, sometimes in a matter of just months. And it became clear to me really early on that we were doing Band-Aid work. And I think Band-Aid work is important, but it's difficult to be putting a little tiny Band-Aid on this kind of huge problem. And so that's when I got interested in looking at the kind of structural roots of the problem as an academic.
Yeah, it's always the challenge to just not be too critical of the Band-Aid work that actually keeps people alive.
Exactly. Yes.
I was reading an article last night about I forget which school. It was a school in Southern California that's opened up a faculty parking lot for their students to park their cars that they sleep in at night. And they were all admitting that, this isn't a solution and there need to be other solutions. But in the meantime, having this and opening up a space where they could shower and use restrooms at night and park their car safely and securely without being taken is like a great help for people.
Huge.
So you don't want to be too critical of it, but you also realize it's just so limited.
Exactly. Yeah. I do. I am a big fan of the Band-Aid work, and there are a lot of organizations doing really incredible stuff. And they all know that it's, limited.
Right.
On the other side of it, as an academic, you start digging into the deeper structural problems at play, and you untangle the fact that it's a much bigger issue than you at first realized.
Right. Because even the thing that limits the people who know that's band work from doing more, the structural conditions that they're facing with.
Exactly.
So how did you start working in the camp in Fresno?
Yeah, Fresno was gaining kind of national coverage for a while for its, it had some of the biggest encampments in the nation. And that was one kind of early days as a graduate student trying to figure out what I wanted to research. I knew I wanted to research the criminalization of homelessness broadly. And then this phenomenon of encampments was getting a lot of press coverage. And I was really interested in the fact that people were able to build entire communities outside of formal housing. And I am originally from Fresno. My father's family is from Fresno, and I knew that I would have sort of an in to the community there. And I had a place to stay. I crashed with my aunt while doing research every time I was in Fresno, and it was a nice kind of excuse to get back to that part of the country, not a part of the country that many people willingly visit. So I thought it was also a useful place to study as a kind of small, unremarkable American city.
Well, I think it was remarkable. I grew up as a New York Mets baseball fan. I wanted to be the next Tom Seaver, and he grew up in Fresno.
See, it's remarkable. I agree. I think it's a remarkable, deeply fascinating place. So actually my book morphed over the years into a bit of a history of Fresno and a love story to Fresno. In some ways, I do love Fresno, despite its really punitive politics to homelessness.
Down the road a bit, San Jose, just this remarkable transformation.
Yes. And there are people in Fresno who are really concerned that Fresno with the high-speed rail will just become a bedroom community for these kind of elite tech hubs. And that really changed Fresno even more. But I think what I love about it is it does have this, it's very rooted in the California Central Valley and in the kind of history of agricultural labor resistance. And it's got this, and it's just an extremely diverse place, a lot of different languages and nationalities and a history of resistance.
So getting into your book a little bit, the title comes right out with bulldozed. So can you tell us a little bit about that, why you chose that as a title?
It's a bold title. I think it's something to grab readers. But I think that the bulldozer is a sort of symbol today for what the U.S. is doing in regards to homelessness. This instrument that has been used as a tool of demolition in public housing projects across the U.S. and so-called slum clearance projects, and also has been used as a tool of military occupation abroad, is now being used to demolish people's tents. And I think when we take a step back and kind of look at the situation in America, we can see that that's a really bizarre thing, that bulldozers are being used on tents. And I think by highlighting that the image of that machine, of the bulldozer. It kind of captures the critique that I'm trying to make of the politics of demolition in the United States.
It's so much about some power, too. Even small city of Kalamazoo, where I teach, there was a camp, 40, 50 people a few years ago in a park downtown. They had bulldozers come in and they just tore everything down and threw it all away. And it's that force of just taking it. You could tell people you have to leave, take your stuff down, but there's something about wanting to use the force to just take everything and destroy it. And in this camp, there were advocates who were donating, going out and buying tents and buying supplies for people, and all of this new stuff they just threw it in dumpsters.
Exactly. It's a destructive tool, and there could be other ways of managing the process. I mean, the federal government for a long time now has been referring to this as what they call the de-encampment process, which I think is a misleading term. But there are some localities that are kind of managing it in the way that you're describing, where social workers will go into a community and say, we want to support you to pack up your things and come into housing. And that there are few and far between places that are doing that kind of work, which is really, really different from bringing in a team of police officers and sanitation workers and demolishing a place.
And unfortunately, in a lot of the places, there's very few safe, secure places of housing for people to move into.
Exactly.
There's a camp here in Lansing, Michigan, down the street from me, about 100 people, and the mayor's been trying to get them to move out, threatening the people who own the land with fines if they won't force them off. Since July, June, they found housing for 3 people out of about 100 that are there. There's just no affordable housing. So where is it people got to go? And that was a great thing about the Supreme Court ruling in 2024, where they said it wasn't cruel and unusual punishment to knock the camps down if there's no other place for people to go. Before that, there was this brief period where people sort of condoned or accepted or tried to manage the camps, and then camps started growing everywhere. But one of the questions that's interesting to me is, why are people going there instead of shelters?
Yeah. I think that's a central question. And it was actually something that was influential in the justice's decision in the 2024 Supreme Court case that you're talking about, was this idea that people are rejecting services or that they're service resistant. And therefore, we need to bring in these kind of huge shows of force to compel people or coerce people into the shelters. And what I can tell you just from my knowledge of the secondary literature, and I know this is something you work on as well, but also my research in Fresno is that a lot of shelters are ill-equipped to provide proper services. And a lot of shelters will require and enforce really inappropriate and kind of draconian rules and restrictions. So I knew someone in Fresno who was homeless with her grandson, who was 12 at the time, and the woman's shelter wouldn't take her grandson. She couldn't stay at the men's shelter, so she had nowhere to go. A lot of people have really, really close relationships to pets. For a lot of women, having a dog is an issue of safety, and shelters, of course, by and large, don't accept pets. And probably the most difficult thing that people face in the shelter system is not having storage and having to be kind of kicked out early in the morning and having to wander around the city all day, carrying all your worldly goods on your back, and then come back and wait in line at a certain time in the evening in order to get back into the shelter. And some people, there are some people with full-time jobs. I think people sometimes don't believe this, but if you are working a 9 to 5, how are you going to carry all your world goods? And how are you going to show up back in line at the shelter at 5 p.m.? And so I knew people who couldn't stay in shelters because they couldn't wait in line at 5 o'clock because they were working. There's a lot of different reasons why the shelters are not providing appropriate care. And that's kind of aside from all the ideological factors of the shelter system is really deeply steeped in this kind of medicalization that tells people you are sick and we need to cure you. Or it's steeped in a kind of evangelical Christian tradition that says you're sinful and we need to cure you. And I think there's a lot of resistance to that just on ideological grounds as well.
Yeah, people
People I talk
to often have this idea that they want to be treated as full adults.
Yes.
And not infantilized. And there's all these rules. But then there's other groups that you can't have. The dogs is such a big thing for people. But if you come in, if you're a family or if you have a partner of the same sex, so many of these shelters won't let you in.
Yes.
And that you can't stay with your family.
Yes.
And so you have to choose about that. And why force people to do that?
Yes, exactly. One of the women that I interviewed and talked to about her experience of homelessness in Fresno, she was kicked out of the shelter when she was 6 months pregnant because the shelter said it's a liability for us. So at 6 months, you have to go.
The shelter I worked at in Massachusetts, this was one of the things that led us to being open 24 hours because there were so many people who were working second shift jobs. They get back at, 11:30 at night. And then at 7 o'clock in the morning, we have to kick them out to go on the streets again. Just seemed like it was just so ridiculous to do that. It was literally working in the shelters. That was the worst part of the day, was if working an overnight shift and having to get everybody up and force them to go outside. When there was nothing good for them to do during the day. If people were working, they were working second shift mostly, food service types of jobs.
Yeah.
So go back to the camps. This dismantling of the camps, this is often portrayed as forcing people to accept help that they just aren't willing to take, or as sort of a public sanitation, public safety issue. If it was just about sanitation, wouldn't that be pretty easy to solve? Just get some dumpsters there, clean up that, put some porta potties out for people to use. So it doesn't seem like that's really the answer. What is it? You had this paper about contemporary revanchism. Is this an extension of that? A revision of that? What did you see? How did they justify the bulldozing of the camp in Fresno? And then what do you think was really behind it?
Yeah, that's sort of the structure of the book, really, is because initially when I went to Fresno, they hadn't started the bulldozing campaign yet, and it was sort of temporary reprieve under which people's informal housed communities were allowed to flourish. And then by the end of my first summer of research there, they knocked all the camps down. And so the initial project was wanting to look at, what is the sociology of these encampments? And the project morphed very quickly into why is the city doing this? And the answer that I outline in the book is threefold. It's partly revanchist, but I've arranged it around the three main sections of the book, which are on profit, punishment, and prejudice. So one major driver of this is urban revitalization and urban neoliberalism. We live in this era in which cities have to make money, and urban space has become this tool for cities to bring in urban revenue. And this is especially true of a lot of downtown cores. A lot of old Skid Row neighborhoods become these kind of frontiers for so-called revitalization projects to try to bring in investment, to try to bring in more high-income residents, to try to bring in, expensive downtown lofts. And so this pushes this drive to what they call clean up the downtown neighborhoods and kick out the encampments that tend to cluster around shelters. This was definitely the pattern in Fresno, and I think it's the pattern in a lot of cities where skid rows are kind of adjacent to downtowns in North America. So that's the first part, profit. The second part, well, actually, the profit chapter has two components. I think it's a really complicated answer, a complicated question. The second component is that there has historically been funding for Housing First in the United States. And what I saw in Fresno was that funding was often contingent on development projects. And development projects were contingent on what the federal government called the de-encampment process. So bringing in, Fresno wanted to attract federal funds and had to show that they were getting rid of their encampments in order to do so. And this was even the case under the Obama administration. And in the second part of the book, I look at punishment and look at the ways in which the kind of welfare system in the United States and the carceral system in the United States have increasingly kind of collapsed. And these two systems are historically interrelated. Historically, the poorhouse and the jail were the same institution in colonial America. Increasingly today, shelters have started more and more to collaborate with systems of incarceration. We see a lot of shelters that have jail diversion programs, for example, and I think that just adds to the resistance to the shelter system. And we see this trend that I describe, which is what I call the trend of tent wars, which is creating these kind of top-down carceral tent city spaces. And so it's the imperative to kind of manage what is seen as unmanageable and to bring it into this kind of carceral welfarist system. And then the last section of the book, which I think maybe is it underlies the other two sections, is prejudice. And I use the word prejudice because I think it encompasses the kind of intersectional range of biases that unhoused people have to confront, from ableism to heterosexism to racism. And there is this underlying belief that unhoused people are responsible for their own condition, and that the condition of homelessness is an individual failure. And so in this part of the book, I kind of unravel in particular bias against people who experience health needs and people whose sanitation needs are not met. So these camps don't have sanitation. And that means that a lot of neighbors are complaining. And cities, rather than saying, okay, this is a sanitation crisis, like you said, let's bring in some dumpsters, let's bring in some portable toilets. Instead, they say, this is a disgusting mess and it needs to go. And I hate to use that language, but that's actually the kind of language that's getting used in Fresno. And it's now the kind of language that's getting used by the Trump administration.
And a lot of good liberal Democratic mayors.
Yeah, exactly.
The country too.
It's true.
It's not just Trump. It's both of those parties, I think.
It's true. I say this in my book. This revanchism, which I think you're right, it is revanchism, is not a partisan issue. It has been imposed by some of the most liberal cities in the U.S.
Yeah, San Francisco's infamous for some of the things that they've done. The prejudice. I often wonder if African Americans weren't so vastly overrepresented among the homeless. Do you think it'd be so easy to criminalize it?
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, and something I talk about in the book, that, just coming off of the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, for example, who looks at the U.S. incarceration system as a way to warehouse poor people of color, largely, that the response to homelessness cannot be disentangled from those that are racist to their core. And if homelessness wasn't seen and perceived as a phenomenon that was experienced more among Black communities, I think the response would be very different.
Yeah. There's also this question about a different type of prejudice, I think, that you mentioned when you talk about attacks on urban informality and how that doesn't fit into, these dominant notions about what a proper housing market and the correct way to be housed are. And is it something about maybe colonialism or the remnants of that and the notions of how to make people normalized into a particular vision of what it means to be a proper person, proper subject at this moment in time?
Yes, I definitely think it's important to look at homelessness in the U.S. today as both a colonial condition and a condition of capitalism, the two being fundamentally interrelated. There is a long history that explains why homelessness is experienced at much higher rates among Black and Indigenous communities. And that's a history of systematic exclusion from access to public benefits. Public benefits for housing reinforced a very specific vision of domesticity that was rooted in a kind of white heteronormative vision of the suburban white picket fence. So it's not simply that it's prejudice against people, it's also prejudice against alternative familial structures. For example, if you have say, a grandparent who's raising children or a family friend who's raising children, they don't have access to the same kinds of resources and services that a family who's seen as normative does. And they'll be even more likely to be rejected by the shelter system, right? And that's something that I saw over and over again in encampments, was a desire to form different kinds of communities and to break out of that kind of mold of the typical vision of American domesticity.
I was talking with Brandon Robinson. I don't know if you know their work on LGBTQ youth, and they're doing this new project of trying to get grandparents and aunts to intervene early on when families sort of reject the young people to help prevent the homelessness. But it's a challenge because there's all these structures and systems that become more challenging to negotiate if you're not in the proper family.
That sounds like interesting work.
Yep. So how about home? Do you think that it's did you see people making the tent city into a home, into a community, place of belonging? One of the things in the U.S. now that's getting a lot of attention is this big social isolation a loneliness issue. And when you talk to people who work in the camps, who live in some of these camps, a lot of people, what they say is this is a place of belonging, of community for them. It's where they've made a home. And they don't have a home if they're in a shelter. So, did you find that in Fresno?
Yes, yes. And I think your question is very eloquently put that for some people, the community constituted home more than the adequacy of shelter. People would prefer to have a tent if that meant being embedded in a caring community than they would to even to be housed. And I did know a few people who said that they would prefer to live in the encampment even over a voucher in a subsidized housing project. And that's partly because those housing projects were far away from their community. And I think it's a community born of, it's a sort of last resort. People who find themselves in similar conditions and aren't receiving care from other sources and are able to find a kind of common ground with each other. That's rare. The kind of American dream of isolated domesticity, which is a very alienated dream. And in the kind of American dream of individualism, where we're all sort of competing individuals trying to succeed, there were a lot of really radical ideas emerging out of encampments about a more collectivist way of living.
Well, there's these groups in Portland and Seattle that are self-governing camps, collective places. We can't have that, can we? That might, if we learn about that, that might give people really crazy ideas about working collectively.
It might give people the idea that they're empowered to do something different, to break out of the norm. Yeah. I don't know if you've talked to Stephen or if you're going to about his book on Portland. Apparently, Portland is now adopting the sort of revanchist approach as well, unfortunately.
But they have some city councilors who are pushing back, and there's some challenges to that are going on. It's interesting. But yeah, I just scheduled a time to talk with him about it. Fascinating book. Caring is interesting. One of the things that I love reading the draft of your book was the humanity with which you discussed the people you came to know in the research. It's almost as if you saw these people as, I don't know, real human beings with strengths and skills and challenges, just like all of us have, and not just solely as these deviant subjects in need of being fixed and reformed. Can you talk a bit about your thoughts and learning when you're doing the ethnography, of learning about the people there, that these are real human beings and complex people who care and think and struggle together?
I think it was helpful that I was already kind of embedded in Fresno and had connections in the Fresno advocacy and activist movement around homelessness, that I was able to feel positioned as a friend rather than as a researcher in a way. Because people in the camps were very familiar with researchers. For example, people who would come out and do the point in time surveys every other year would come out with teams of police officers and with clipboards and would ask 5-minute surveys. There's something really beautiful about ethnography where you're just kind of hanging out and spending a lot of time, and you can't help but form friendships in that context. I think it was also influential on me that in the intervening years, I'd worked on another research project that I'm still kind of wrapping up. While writing this book and while traveling back and forth to Fresno, I had another research project on memoirs and oral histories of homelessness. So it involved reading almost 100 memoirs written by people about their experiences of homelessness and reading oral histories from all over the United States. And there's something really beautiful about this life narrative approach, and that it is exactly about portraying humanity in its fullness. And I think if you are to look at any subject, the human as the entry point is often the most interesting entry point into that subject, the kind of full life story of a person. And so I made that effort in writing the book to begin with life stories primarily.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I think people should read this book. Those life stories really frame that these are real people, actual human beings who are struggling, but also have full experiences of being human, right? They're not just these, I don't know, people who need to be fixed, who need to be removed from public view so that we could develop the waterfront, right? There's a camp in Fresno was on the river, right? Rivers are now looked at as like a great economic resource.
A lot of the officials in charge of managing encampments were actually canal officials, because a lot of the encampments were clustered around canals.
kind of extending that a bit, I'm not sure if this is happening in the UK where you are now, but here, altruism is increasingly being understood and portrayed as a problem by some. Elon Musk famously has said this, but this is the great flaw. But it's going to be the downfall of Western civilization if people embrace altruism or act like Mackenzie Scott and give away money. That's really terrible to do. But this is a lot of evangelical leaders are also portraying this idea of altruism as bad, as flawed. The only real help can come through toughness and punishment of non-conforming ways of being. And I wonder if you saw this cultural engagement to push these ideologies of individualism, competition, capitalist marketplace as the only proper way of being.
Yes. And it is this kind of mingling of, at least in Fresno, it was this mingling of hyper-capitalist ideology with evangelical ideology, because the churches in Fresno have historically been very powerful. It's historically a conservative Christian city. And I think that combination is quite dangerous for unhoused people in particular. And a lot of people believed really deeply. There were a lot of passionate people who saw themselves as compassionate people, who worked in the shelter industry in Fresno, who believed very deeply that the only way to solve this problem was with a kick in the pants and with tough love. And I think there's a lot of deeper underlying psychological neuroses at play that are it's outside of my area of expertise. But there's this idea that soft kindness and gentleness will make people indulgent somehow. My experience in the research on, for example, harm reduction and trauma-informed care, actually compassion is the number one thing that supports people in their healing.
Yeah, and there's research on compassion-informed care that shows how effective it can be. But of course, don't want to be fooled by looking at the research findings. You don't want that to interfere with your biases. A few minutes ago, you mentioned neoliberalism. I wonder if we can understand the prevalence and the resiliency of homelessness over these last 30, 40 years by, all of this efforts, right? All these well-meaning efforts to resolve it in different ways, but it continues. And I'm wondering, can we understand that without looking at it within the context of the dominance of neoliberal policies, practices, ideologies, market-based solutions, individualism, destruction of public spaces, destruction of collective approaches, regulating behaviors of poor people for quest for so-called individual responsibility, all of these things about remaking people, as Nicholas Rose talks about, sort of remaking the subject into a particular type of person. And so that only responsible, self-governing people deserve help or deserve housing. And that help often comes in policing their behaviors. So what do you think? Can we understand the pervasiveness of homelessness without situating it within the dominance of these policies and ideas?
In the U.S. context, no. I think that really is the underlying mechanism behind not only the rise in this kind of hyper-revanchist approach, but also the rise in homelessness is a direct result of neoliberalizing housing markets and financializing housing markets. It's just, we've lived through this astronomical change in cities with the skyrocketing of housing prices. And the idea that that's not going to result in higher rates of eviction and displacement and homelessness it's mind-boggling to me. And I think sometimes homelessness still gets seen as a kind of aberration of the capitalist system, when we know there's, a long history of great Marxist scholarship that has shown us that homelessness is an inevitable byproduct of the capitalist system, seeks to produce profit out of space, whether that be public space or whether that be, the private space of marketized housing. Rents are going to go up. Public parks are going to be turned into sort of privatized areas where you're no longer free to just sit on a sidewalk or sleep on a bench. I think these processes are all interrelated, and I think the category of neoliberalism is very helpful. I do think from an international perspective, I know a lot of great scholars who are hesitant about the word neoliberalism because there has been this, trend under the Washington Consensus to try to make neoliberalism penetrate into all corners of the world. I think it's important to look at homelessness in each context in its own deep historicized regional geography. It's a bit of a jargonized answer to that question.
So let's move into that then, because one of my next questions was going to ask just about that. You had this paper, 2023, Early Geographies of Homelessness, Informality, Precarity, and Theory from the Global South. So that's one of my goals for this podcast, is to talk to people from around the world about, and learn the perspectives there. And it might not be clear because the first couple guests were all people working pretty much in California or in the West Coast. But the idea is to push it beyond that. How do we, move beyond just a focus on particular these Western large cities, globalize our understandings of what's happening, but also the possibilities of struggle and challenges and policies and interventions in different spaces and places too. Can you talk about your argument in that paper a little bit more, why you think that's necessary to do?
Yeah. It's a bit of an intervention into the academic space where arguments and theories that have emerged from the context of the global north often just get slapped onto contexts in the global south inappropriately. So again, rooted in these deep colonial histories, but this time in academic knowledge production. And this is an inequality, and it creates bad trends in knowledge as well. And so I think it's really important for scholarship that's looking at housing crises and homelessness in global south contexts to be listened to and to be cited and to be drawn on from scholars in the global north. And I think that there are a lot of concepts that are emerging out of those conversations around cities in the global south that could be really instructive, because we can be a bit myopic when we're only looking at one tiny context. And sometimes it's easy to adopt the language of policy. And in some ways, homelessness has become the language of policy. And perhaps homelessness is not the most useful category. I think a lot of academics are coming to this. So that's one reason why I wanted to make this intervention. But also, I think it's important in the arena of global solidarity. At whatever scale we're looking at, solidarity between movements will always make a movement stronger. So movements speaking to each other and supporting each other and sharing ideas. And there have been movements of unhoused and informally housed people in the global south who have made that effort. In the 90s, the South African Organization of Homeless People did really exciting things, interviewing people in Mumbai, interviewing people all over the world about the shared global problem of informal housing, precarious housing, and homelessness. And I think academics need to pay attention to those movements. And I think those movements not only push back against the housing crisis that has produced homelessness, but also push back against the kind of xenophobia and hyper-nationalism that is the context of neoliberalism in the world today as well. And so there are a couple of kind of concepts that have emerged out of some of the literature looking at cities in India, for example, that I say might be useful to us who are researching the United States and researching other cities in the global north, like precarity, housing precarity, for example, and like informality. And I think those concepts are useful because they help us to say and to see homelessness is not an aberration. Homelessness is one part of the housing system, and it is an inevitable byproduct of the capitalist housing system. And they enable us to look at the way in which a lot of contexts in the global north have this rejection of people's informal structures. And this is an argument that Ananya Roy has made powerfully as well.
Well, even reading the work from people in Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, they seem to think it's important to differentiate, learn from the European South and not just focus on the European North too. And I think you have the same thing there, that the conditions there might be a little bit different than in the North.
And we were kind of having this conversation just within the United States before we turned on the record button, that there are regions in the United States that get overlooked and underexamined. The U.S. South, not a tremendous amount of research on homelessness comes out of the U.S. South or the U.S. Midwest. It's very West Coast focused or big city focused. And so as a geographer, there's an interest in kind of looking at regions that are epistemologically underexamined and underacknowledged.
It does seem like with housing in the U.S., it's New York, L.A., Seattle, San Francisco. Maybe you'd mention Chicago here and there. on any type of sociological, geographic type of research. It's as though these places speak for every place. And I could see what you're doing and the conditions that you're working under and the particular types of interventions you're trying to do are also being ignored. But also the point that you brought up about expanding this, not just looking at homelessness. I think we need to look at housing precarity, but economic precarity and emotional insecurities, and how all three of these things are working together and being produced powerfully, but also slightly differently in different places, and then how they're being responded to in different places. Because it's so easy to separate these issues, but it's these bigger trends that are creating this instability and insecurity for so many people.
Yeah.
I think about some of the movements in South and Central America too, that there's really interesting ideas happening and emerging in certain places. How do you think about how to live well together? Imagine if we had something like that in the North, if that was a goal of living well. What about being happy? We can't possibly have that as a goal.
And that's something that actually has emerged out of the context of U.S. encampments and camp communities, is turning to the Americas more broadly. There's a camp in Florida, I'm not remembering the name, that was inspired by the landless workers movement in Brazil. And there's a project in Oakland called the Homelessness Project that is very explicitly situates itself as a decolonial project within the broader kind of region of the Americas, and turning to other forms of knowledge and indigenous forms of knowledge to think about how to live, what a home looks like, what a community looks like.
That's really excited. A couple of weeks, I'm going to get to talk to Julia Christensen, who does this work up in the Northwest Territories in Nunavut. And that's exactly the question there. So how do people conceptualize home? And how is that disrupted by settled colonialism? How are people trying to reformulate this?
Yes.
Different ways of thinking and being, but also can we learn from that in other locations? So one thing that I've often thought about is it's really easy to analyze and write another academic paper on what's wrong with dominant responses, which, they clearly don't work very well. But you haven't just been satisfied with that, right? I'm thinking of this recent work with David Medina, the housing squeeze design. It seems to be an effort to globalize our understanding of housing insecurity, right? But in the form, it's a different type of form and format that intervene towards creating spaces for imagining and enacting sort of more radically transformative housing possibilities. And then speaking to a different audience than is just going to read another academic paper. Can you talk about why you did that and what you've found through these engagements on these more global scale?
I think you've hit the nail on the head that it was born out of this desire to get outside of the little bubble that we live in, with it's just an echo chamber of academics often complaining to each other about the problems. And I want my work to, and I've thought about this for a while, I want to have my audience in mind for my work to be people with experience of houselessness and homelessness themselves. I don't want to exclude that audience. And people can't access academic articles. You have to pay for them. And so I got turned on to zines as kind of an alternate media production that's very much rooted in grassroots resistance movements. It's rooted in a kind of grassroots publication. And there are all these networks of zine fairs and other kind of ways of distributing zines among activist groups that really excited me. And I thought it was a way as well to build a kind of alternative sociality among activist scholars themselves. We tend to get together and really depress each other with talking about the state of the world. And so doing something that was, like you said, imagining alternative futures in a kind of playful and spontaneous way, it helped us kind of break out of that trend. And hopefully it helped us to forge some solidarities. The group that I mentioned to you, that a colleague and I are working on forming, that's a kind of international collective of scholar activists around homelessness, actually started and was born in that zine making session. But it's a concern for mine going forward is the politics of knowledge and making sure that I'm not just writing in a particular exclusionary venue.
It takes some courage to do that. I've been thinking for at least 15 years, and I talked to the editor at of my book about this idea. She was very excited about it, of doing graphic novels.
Yes.
But I just feel like I just don't have the skills to do it or the
Yeah.
courage to try it, to try something new.
It's so funny that you bring that up because I am now working with some illustrators on potentially developing a graphic novel. And like you, I would love to be able to do it myself, but I doubt my skills. So that's why I was thinking of collaborating.
Even just the writing part, she was going to set me up with an illustrator. But just thinking about how to write it in that way was such a challenge because I was so used to the particular academic way of writing. And now I'm trying to think about, can I do creative nonfiction or even fiction
Amazing.
on these ideas that I'm concerned about. But it's like retraining your brain to act and be differently, but also having the vulnerability of trying something new. When it's so easy just to write another academic paper.
Exactly.
The people you talked with across the world doing this work, it just seems like that's a way of kind of getting the ideas, different ideas out and accessible to more people using these sort of non-traditional ways of doing it. And portraying ideas, conveying ideas to people. So I'm wondering about, you did another paper just this year, the personal reflections one on the UK housing emergency. Can you talk a little bit about that work and why you all chose that approach? It was more of a collaborative effort, but it's also a sort of a non-traditional approach to looking at these issues.
I wish I could say that we had the foresight to decide to all collaborate and come together, but we were actually invited by the British Academy to give talks, and this paper was born out of those talks. But I'm really happy with how it turned out in that it's bringing together really disparate critiques of UK housing that might not necessarily be placed together and kind of putting them in conversation with each other.
This is going to be an unfair question to ask you to do in a couple minutes, but can you give any impressions on the differences with housing precarity in the UK versus the US?
Well, this was the subject of the little reflection that I contributed to this co-authored piece, which was the thing that shocked me most moving here, was the degree to which homelessness in the UK understood here as rough sleeping being the condition of actually sleeping outside. Rough sleeping here in the UK is seen as a migrant phenomenon. And by and large, that's true. In London, the majority of rough sleepers before Brexit were non-UK nationals. And there's a very interesting history behind this story. So the UK historically post-war actually had a really radical social housing project, which was social housing for all, not just for the poor. And obviously we've seen that has been decimated over the years, particularly under Margaret Thatcher. But today in the UK, we've got this system where there are some emergency measures in place to prevent homelessness, right? You can apply to your local council for homelessness funding to try to get an emergency housing voucher. And so there is a bit more of a safety net here than there is in the US. So rates of homelessness here are lower, rough sleeping. But when it comes to people who are on visas, when it comes to asylum seekers, there are literally no protections in place. And that's explicit policy that visa holders have no access to public resources. And that is much more draconian than the US system. So again, this is somewhere where I look to the US and say, wow, the US is actually doing something better than the UK when it comes to immigration. That's so shocking. We know that the US is extremely brutal when it comes to the ability of migrants to access public services, the US is decentralized enough that people can access some state and local services. And even if you're undocumented, you could access a shelter, for example. Here in the UK, it's all very centralized, and there is a blanket exemption to accessing any benefits here. It's an extremely brutal system. They have what's called the hostile environment approach to migration here. So it's very explicit.
And then you have to understand that too, crafting that. There's a lot of people who are feeling very economically vulnerable.
Yes.
And the easy thing to do is to blame the other.
Yes. Exactly. And so this is kind of the argument that I make in this little short reflection, is that there's a displacement there is a legitimate housing crisis that's partly the result of austerity in this country, partly the result of skyrocketing housing prices. And the anxiety around that economic crisis is being displaced onto this population panic about migration. Yes, it's surprising that the degree of poverty in this country really shocked me, and the economy is shrinking here. It's not growing. And I don't think I realized just how much wealth there is in the US before leaving it.
Right.
Not that wealth is evenly distributed. Obviously, we know that inequality rates in the US are higher than they are here, but there's a lot of wealth in the US.
Yeah, well, if you dominate the globe militaristically and economically for 50 years, that's some benefits for you. So one last question. Do you have any thoughts on what we might do to be more impactful on both challenging the dominant ideas about homeless and unhoused people? And I think what you talked a bit about before about expanding these categories and not just look at homeless people, housing precarity is one step in that. But also that and on creating spaces for new ways of thinking and acting to emerge. Can we possibly go Ruth Wilson Gilmore's idea about beginning an abolitionist movement in prisons? Can we begin an abolition movement for homelessness? What would it need to do to produce that, to end homelessness and these conditions producing isolation, economic, emotional insecurity, and precarities? That's an easy question for you to solve.
I love that you brought in abolition, and I love the language of abolition because I think it allows us to dream big. And I think that's the most important thing. Obviously, this is not a question that any one of us can answer, but it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot. It's important for us to keep asking this question of each other over and over again. I think the question in itself is important. How can we have an abolition movement around homelessness? And as a Marxist, I follow the kind of Gramscian tradition that ideology matters. And I think that's convenient because I'm working in kind of an intellectual sphere. But I do think it is crucial for us to build tangible arguments for why this is possible. I think that, and I don't mean this to sound overly earnest or cheesy, but I don't think it is. I think it's important for us to have a kind of radical hope right now with the Trump administration, with the genocide in Gaza, with everything that's going on in the world, the rise of populism worldwide. It's so easy to see a kind of downward trend in our political, economic, and social life. And I think for those reasons, hope becomes even more radical and even more important. And having these conversations, but having these conversations in ways that aren't siloed. So I am fundamentally opposed to the idea of expertise and the idea that, these highly trained people who've never experienced homelessness themselves are going to, be able to answer questions like these. I think that there are a lot of incredible grassroots activist movements on the ground who are looking at these questions and thinking about these questions and how to answer them and collaborating with each other. I know on the West Coast, there's WRAP, the Western Regional Advocacy Project, which brings together a lot of unhoused activist movements. And I do think on the ideological front, amplifying those voices and building solidarity between people in the homelessness sector who are kind of on the side of this abolition movement and people in the academic world and people who are experiencing homelessness will be really key. And so really, this is a long rambling answer just to say solidarity building and connection building and kind of moving away from these individualizing modes of life that we've been told to follow.
Yeah. One of my mentors in grad school, Julie Graham, who just tragically died way too young. Julie, for the last several years of her life, really arguing that what we need is to perform and as politics of hope, right? That we need to think about community economies and solidarity economies instead of just critiquing capitalism. But to me, it's such a powerful way of thinking and acting it, both in terms of practices, but in ideology. How do we engage people? There needs to be some type of hope. There needs to be some type of way of imagining and dreaming differently about this.
And I think in some ways it's a false binary or a false dichotomy between this and then the kind of broader structural economic critique of capitalism. These things can take place alongside each other.
There seems to be, among people writing on homelessness and housing, and an unwillingness to specifically talk about capitalism. And I wonder if you see that and if you have any thoughts as to why that might be.
Yeah, I was actually just talking with a colleague about this just 2 days ago. There's an enormous amount of literature and research out there on homelessness, and a lot of it comes out of kind of psychiatric journals. A lot of it is looking at individual so-called deficits and measuring deficits. Or a lot of it will, be just tinkering with ideas around how to improve policy in small ways. And I think well-meaning people who are interested in ending homelessness are engaging in this kind of approach. But we live in a world in which the critique of capitalism was unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say we live in a world. The United States is a context in which the critique of capitalism was really successfully demonized. And it's almost an untouchable thing in academia. And to say publicly, I'm a Marxist scholar will kind of mark me for being not taken seriously in policy circles, perhaps. And I think that really does have to do with Cold War ideological histories in ways that go, beyond the scope of my expertise and knowledge. That's something that we have to be able to bring back that critique of capitalism and drop the Cold War baggage that we're still hanging on to. And I think there are a lot of movements in the US that are doing this right now. For example, is critiquing capitalism. Bernie Sanders is critiquing capitalism. We have so many local politicians who are really based in the desire for a broad-based working class movement that also brings in identity politics critiques, right? That marries these two things, and that's really, really exciting to me. And I do think historically, just thinking of the academic literature on critiques of capitalism, it was really narrow historically. Early labor movements in the U.S. were racially exclusionary and gendered exclusionary, and so there are these unfortunate histories of anti-capitalist movements that we can look back on and say, well, we know now that we don't want to do that. We want to have an intersectional anti-capitalist movement. If you are on board with that concept of intersectionality, I know some Marxists are a little bit hesitant to adopt that language, but I think it is one of the most important things for us to embrace intersectionality in a way that doesn't water it down into a kind of depoliticized identity politics, but to marry it with the anti-capitalist underpinnings. And without that, we're creating divisions on the left, and that's the ultimate barrier to making any progress.
So thank you very much. Inspirational and interesting. So
Thank you. I really, really enjoyed your questions, and yeah, it's great to see you again after all these years.
yeah. Well, thanks.